Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. I recognise a few faces, so it's nice to see some of you again. So I think one of the starting points I often find with audit committees or audit and assurance committees or finance and reporting and assurance committees, whatever else it might be called, is people feel a little bit of a fear about them. So it feels like it's a committee that we need to have a massive skill set. There is often an assumption that we have to be an auditor to be on that committee, or some sort of deep risk expert. But my experience is that very often it's the mix of different viewpoints. As Sarah knows, I am a massive champion of diversity and inclusion, and I think the Audit and Risk Committee is one of those places where diversity of thought is absolutely critical. Now, my career as an audit committee member started back in, I think it was 2000, and just trying to work it out in my head, probably about 2008, when, I didn't have a massively senior role in my organisation. And when I got accepted onto this committee, now, completely honestly, I suspect that I was probably maybe the youngest person that had applied for it, and probably also the only woman who'd applied in that area, because they were looking for somebody who had both some education experience, because it was an education body, and also some financial statements experience, and preferably came from the local area. Well, looking around the local area, I knew I was the only person that filled those boxes. So I was under no pretense as to why it was I'd been appointed to this committee. But it took me a good year to work out what my committee skill set actually was. That first year, I was totally focused on the fact that I was an auditor. So I was kind of thinking about auditory things. I was looking at the numbers, I was looking at the finance, I was looking at the risk register, I was looking at the detail. It took me a good year to realise, actually, that wasn't the value that I could bring to that committee at all. Now, there were times when I could bring broader experience and say, yeah, we're not being spun a line. We're not being spun a line by our advisors or our consultants. This is what's happening elsewhere as well. So having some knowledge was really useful. However, the biggest skill that I realised I brought was nothing to do with the detail of the financials and things like that. Very often, it was actually the fact that I brought a broader, wider thinking perspective. So I was much more interested in almost the politics of the committee sometimes. How were we engaging with it? What we were listening to? What were we missing? How were we asking questions of our advisors? Now, for those of you that kind of see some of the things that I do now, my focus is very heavily on that interface between people and inclusion and behaviours, and the kind of the compliance and the risk sides of things. And that was where I started to learn that that was a skill that I could bring. Now, I would say if I get appointed to an audit and risk committee these days, it's that skill that I'm being appointed for, not necessarily the fact that I'm still a chartered accountant and I've got lots of experience in risk. And the same thing is true of anybody going on to an audit and risk committee. Absolutely, we need people who you need at least one person who understands the intricacies of audit, and particularly if it's also a finance committee, you need people who've got the finance understanding. But moreover, you need that person who sits there and goes, but hang on a second, why have you all sat there nodding with that? I don't understand the point. Or the person that brings a different perspective. For most of us now, one of our biggest risks is people. And one of the biggest gaps that I see on audit and risk committees is that person who has that understanding of people, who can bring it, or who can bring it back to more organizational development aspects. One of the problems, if you have lots of people who are really detail oriented on the audit committee, is that they focus on what is there, not what isn't. And I've seen that happen in a lot of cases where the audit committee has almost been the place where all the very detailed operational people get sort of channeled towards. So it ends up with a lot of people who'll pick over and kind of go, paragraph 15, I wasn't quite sure what this number meant, or, I don't think this chart was very well labelled. The point with that is they're totally missing the point. Now, the thing is, it might be that they comment more often, but what I've seen over the years is it's very often the person who wouldn't have naturally put themselves forward for an audit risk committee who asks the most valuable questions. So the value that we can all bring to an audit committee is almost looking for that piece that kind of goes, what's everybody else missing? You know, this is not just focusing on what I'm being told and what's in front of me. It's thinking about what isn't there in front of me. Having a great memory is also great on audit and risk committee. Being able to remember that we all asked about something 2 meetings ago and have we actually seen on it, that ability to follow up on stuff. I always like to make sure, because that isn't my skill, if I'm audit and risk committee chair, I always like to make sure I've got one of those people who can kind of go, you know, 2 meetings ago, we asked about this. Can you let us know where you're up to with it now, please? That is an amazing skill. That's something that you can really bring value to. But also sometimes that person who can sit there and has the confidence to say, I know this is probably just how it works, but can somebody tell me why that's how it works? So a great example of that is things like, and some of you might recognize it. You don't need to know the detail to understand what we're talking about, but something like a local government pension scheme, which can feel like a really, really big issue, particularly if you're from a sector where there isn't a local government pension scheme deficit. And what I've seen in a lot of organizations is they almost become complacent around that number. It's so horrifically large and it swings by such huge amounts every year. We can become really complacent and we can almost overlook it. But actually, there's so much more to do on pensions, to understand the benefits that are coming to our staff members, to understand the risks that we're taking on, to understand the alternatives. It's very often the person who isn't a deep pension specialist who kind of goes, no, hang on a second. That number is the biggest number in our accounts. And it feels very worrying. What are we doing about it that can turn a conversation on its head? So the value is always to question. The value is to be curious. It's very much what I kind of ascribe to when I'm talking about coaching, or I'm talking about people development, I'm talking about inclusion. What you need to be able to go and add value to an audit and risk committee is to be curious. You need to have that instinctive curiosity and the ability to pull your head up and pull the head of other people up as well. So it doesn't matter if stationery has gone up by £15, you know, that's not that. And I have had somebody ask that in a committee meeting a long time ago. That doesn't matter. The question is, what's our succession plan? You know, we've got a chief executive who's amazing and we've got a lot of dependents in them. What's our succession plan? When we look at the figures around staff retention, they're looking absolutely, you know, turnover is really big. How are we mitigating that risk in the organization? When the internal auditors come and say, right, these are all the different areas we're going to look at this year, instead of saying that looks like a very nice list, look down it and say, what are the things that we've been worrying about at board has not got some assurance here? Understanding, being able to ask the questions of an internal auditor, what assurance they've actually provided, rather than assuming that you're able to tell. Really big mistake a lot of audit committees make is to sort of say, oh, it says strategic review, therefore we've had our strategic review looked at. It's a really tiny part of strategic review. Those people who see internal audit reports day in, day out might just go, oh yeah, I see what it is. I see what it is. It's the person who sits there and goes, I don't understand how this title matches up with the work that you've said you've done. What does this mean for us as a broader organization? Those are the amazing questions. So bringing value is all about the curiosity. And you didn't have to kick me yet, Sarah, but I know you've got another question.
That's impressive. Well done, Jenny. Jenny and I thought of 2 questions that would help, and maybe Jenny, a couple of thoughts on these questions. But the 2 questions that we thought would help with discussion now. One is, what's your experience of contributing to audit committees to date? You might never have joined one, and you might know that that's on the cards for the coming year, or you might be chairing one. Who knows? And then the second is, what could your superpower be at an audit committee? So Jenny's given lots of hints there of things that I know for me listening to it, it's definitely, I don't feel like you need to have come from an audit background to be able to make those points or tease those things out of the committee. So I hope it's been really encouraging for you. Jenny, any thoughts on those questions? And then we will share them and kick people off.
Excellent. Superpower is something I always talk about in coaching, and I think it helps give us confidence. But I think the thing about the superpower as well is that it might change from committee to committee. So, you know, particularly if it's a committee of an organisation that you're already part of, thinking about what it is that people have complimented you on doing in the past. Think about what it is that you bring to a group of people, because that's what we are as committees. What's your take or your spin that you bring in different situations? And maybe you have several different superpowers, and it's working out, once you see a committee in action, that you can work out which one you're really going to dial into. And I think teaching yourself that agility to develop more superpowers is really important. And I deliberately use the word superpower because too often we get really CV language based about these things, whereas actually when you're trying to motivate yourself to do this stuff, talk in the language of superpowers, because it sounds so ridiculous. You're much more likely to pick the stuff that you're really, really good at, instead of being really humble and downplaying what it is that you can actually do. So when you're talking about the superpowers, which I would recommend you talk about that alongside what contributions you've already made. Allow yourself to say so without caveating it, because that's how you'll really properly embrace it and capture it.